If you've ever been to a performance by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, the New York Philharmonic, or any other large ensemble, what was it like? It probably took place in a grand hall with high ceilings, ornate paneling, and perfect acoustics. But if you peered down at the stage, you most likely saw many rows of mainly white and Asian musicians. If you were lucky, maybe you pinpointed one or two artists who were Hispanic or Black. In 2016, African Americans made up just 1.8% of orchestras nationwide. Hispanics represented 2.5%. This is according to an industry-wide study conducted by the League of American Orchestras. Even today, despite a greater focus on diversity and inclusion, the composition of prominent classical symphonies hasn't changed much, with minorities still being severely underrepresented at all levels.
I would love to see more opportunities for minorities to participate in apprenticeship programs. Lessons get started at a really early age. There are orchestras that, once you get seated in an orchestra, you're there for life. And, they're like 85-year-olds who they're not giving up that seat for anything. And just the opportunity for different people. And when people say equity and diversity, throwing one Black person in and having them play one part, or playing a piece by a Black composer once a year, that's not really diversity and equity. I really want to see people put their money where their mouth is.
That's Brendan Slocum, a professional violinist and school music educator. He says that there are opportunities for change in classical music, but they need to be made more available to minorities. Over the years, Slocum has performed with the Washington Metropolitan Symphony, the McLean Symphony, and other prominent orchestras across the East Coast. In his career, there have been several instances where others have made him feel like he doesn't belong.
There are not a lot of people that looked like me who were doing what I was doing, and it was a little bit discouraging. I would walk in and people just wouldn't believe that I was up to the task of playing, and I'm sitting ready to play, and the director would put someone else on my part with me to, quote unquote, help me out because they didn't think that I could do it, before they even heard me play a note. And that happened quite often. Or when I would go to a classroom to teach before the students knew who I was, or even the parents sometimes, I'd go in and they think that I was one of the custodians, or I was there to move furniture or equipment, until I asked to hold their instrument, which they reluctantly would hand over to me, and I'd play. And then people were like, oh, okay, well, this guy is legit. I guess he really does know what he's doing. But it's always, I always have to prove myself before people take me seriously. And sometimes that gets a bit discouraging, but I just got used to it.
Slocum started playing the violin at age 9 when he was introduced to the stringed instrument through a public school music program in North Carolina.
When I first picked up the violin, I knew I was going to do it for a long, long time. I knew I absolutely loved it, and I wanted to do it as long as I possibly could. It was instant. I knew it from the very first time I picked it up.
As Slocum grew older and moved into his teenage years, he credits music with keeping him on track.
With all the practicing that I would have to do, the discipline that it involved, going to rehearsals, practicing, competitions, just concerts, it really gave me a sense of structure, and it saved my life. It took me to college. It took me around the world. It kept me out of trouble. My friends would go around breaking into people's houses, and I would be at a rehearsal practicing. Or, I have friends now who are currently in prison, and, I was on a trip someplace because of my violin. So it really was a life-saving force for me.
Today, Slocum uses his talent to inspire kids and teenagers through music. He teaches general music, orchestra, and guitar ensembles to students K through 12 in both public and private school settings. He believes it's important for young people to become acquainted with music early on.
Lots of programs in schools, they take kids to see a concert once a year. They should be going once a month. Music should be in the hallways during class change, in the subway, on the bus, not just classical music, but all kinds of music. And, as we're going along and the kids are being more and more exposed to it, let's put instruments in their hands. Let's get them lessons. Let's say a symphony orchestra, a state symphony, instead of spending $80 million on renovating a concert hall, let's take that money and take them around to all of the centers that they can hear a concert around the city. Not everyone can afford to go to, spend $150 to go hear a symphony. And if it was right down the street at their local community center, everyone has the opportunity to hear it.
As an educator, Slocum says the widening gap in music education between public and private schools is only growing worse. In turn, this decrease in exposure for public school students leads to less diversity in genres like classical music.
A lot of public school programs are being cut at an alarming rate, all the arts programs, and that creativity is what the kids need. They need that outlet. Not everyone is on track to be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer. It's not for everyone. Lots of kids are arts oriented, and for a lot of them, that's the only reason they come to school is for their arts classes, their music classes, the chorus, the band, the strings classes, the guitar classes. The only reason they come to school. And if we cut those, we're cutting out an entire generation of kids who could be successful, and you're just throwing another obstacle in their way. So, funding for arts in the private schools are much better than the public schools, and I'm hoping that we can change that.
One group that's doing the work is the Sphinx Organization, a nonprofit program aimed at helping historically excluded populations gain greater exposure to classical music and pursue a career in the genre. One aspect of their work is to dispel certain stereotypes surrounding the genre.
Classical music was present in both Black and diaspora communities, as well as Latinx communities and Hispanic communities all throughout history. So I think there's a misconception that sometimes gets perpetuated as we get more liberal with words, in that classical music was present in these communities. And in fact, there are examples of tremendously talented and prolific, both Black and Brown composers all throughout history, dating back to really the Baroque period.
That's Afa Dworkin, the president and artistic director for Sphinx. The group helps youth and adult artists through a variety of initiatives, one of them being educational music programs, where students are supported by full scholarships.
Throughout the academic year, as well as the summer, we serve young people who have never played an instrument through our Overture program. It's our robust year-round initiative that places instruments in the hands of young people ages 7 through 9 and really develops them all throughout the year and gives them a jump start in terms of creative expression, and hopefully prepares them for other programs should they wish to continue studying an instrument. And then separately, throughout the summer, we hold 3 summer boot camps for young people ages 11 through 17. Now, that group is comprised of young people who have been playing for a number of years and have access to instruments and year-round training, but are looking to kind of ultimately hone their skills and prepare themselves for college careers.
Sphinx has many other initiatives, from funding for individual music lessons to partnerships with top conservatories to provide training for emerging performers. So far, more than 150,000 young people have been served through tuition-free musical training and community engagement. The organization also helps emerging Black and Latino classical musicians with professional development programs and financial assistance. Dworkin believes that at every level of classical music, there needs to be a greater push towards inclusion.
We must look more concretely to our impact as institutions, as partners, as the entire industry. I think in every institution of higher learning, at every presenting house, at every orchestra, every opera company, there needs to be a top-down embrace of diversity, equity, inclusion being not only some level of priority, but really one of core priorities in terms of responding to our ever-shifting, ever-changing, ever-evolving landscape that we're experiencing all throughout communities here in the US. And what that means for me is making conscious decisions about what we're programming on stage. If I live in a town where 80% of people are Black and brown, I think I ought to think about what I'm programming on stage and what 80% of my season looks like. How does that include and reflect the stakeholders or the potential stakeholders around me?
It's true that change doesn't happen overnight, but it also doesn't happen without the initiatives and people that drive a mission forward. People like Afa Dworkin and Brendan Slocum are turning words into action and fostering youth and emerging artists that are aiming to change the classical music landscape. To find out more about this topic and our guests, visit viewpointsradio.org. Check out Brendan Slocum's new book, The Violin Conspiracy, available online now and in bookstores. To learn more about the Sphinx organization, visit sphinxmusic.org. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri, studio production by Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson. Coming up next week.
Under those circumstances, the situation became untenable, and the stresses that the requirements of caregiving required ultimately tore the family apart.
The mental and physical toll of caring for an elderly loved one. Then,
he made a pact with himself that he would do whatever it took, legally and educationally, not to die.
How one guilty man on death row duped the public into believing he was innocent. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth this week on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.